My grandfather operated as a spy during the Cold War for the US government. The term he used was intelligence officer, but I like spy better. During the time I knew him, he was reclusive. Never took much interest in our family. To my knowledge, he was distant with his friends, as well. Most people in his life had no idea as to the full extent of his work. The story I always heard growing up was that he worked in a light bulb factory. He's approaching his 80s now and he recently decided to tell me about his time in the Eastern Bloc. It really came out of the blue. Maybe I'm his favorite grandson. In 1977 he entered the Soviet Union. There was already an established network of spies there, so getting around wasn't much of a challenge. My grandfather's mission concerned one particular military base. There were a few rumors surrounding it. Apparently, the Soviets were developing something even more devastating than the atom bomb. Naturally, the US wanted information. My grandfather was chosen to infiltrate the base for two reasons. 1. He was talented in the field and known for his capabilities. 2. He looked somewhat similar to the mission's target. For the past couple months, operators had been observing one citizen in particular. He was a janitor that worked at the base. He was very unimportant and easily looked over. My grandfather was going to take his place and steal as much information as possible without getting caught. The US knew basically nothing about this base and its workings. Any new information would be very useful. Were they developing chemical or biological weapons? An unbeatable missile defense system? A new method for detecting US nuclear tests? Whatever it was, the US wanted it and wanted it now. Prior to the mission, my grandfather had a couple of minor surgeries to look more like the target. He used secret audio recordings to accurately mimic his voice. He practiced for over a month until he got it just right. A few days prior to the mission, he had even been strategically beaten to obscure his face even more. The claim was that he had gotten in a drunken fight, not remembering most of the details. Business as usual for the target, apparently. Nothing to raise an eyebrow at. My grandfather isn't proud of this next part. While wearing similar clothes to the mark, he entered his house. None of his neighbors noticed this. Anyone who may have seen him probably thought he was the mark. My grandfather killed him while he was sleeping. He used a wire and wrapped it around the man's neck. It was the most difficult thing he had ever done. He had killed people in the line of duty before, but not like this. This was an innocent man. Some parts of my grandfather's service are hazy in his old age, but not this. He remembers every detail as if he were still there. The mark had such fear and confusion in his eyes. He was silently begging for his life. My grandfather considered for a moment, just a fleeting moment, letting him go. He ultimately chose not to. The security of the United States was more important than the life of one man. Despite everything, I believe my grandfather is a good man. Once the deed was done, my grandfather had nowhere to go. He just sat in the dead man's house and waited. The phone rang a couple times. He didn't answer. On the day of the mission, he woke up at 5 a.m. Touched up his makeup just right and prepared for the day ahead. He carried with him a concealable handgun, a lockpick and tension wrench, the mark's ID, wallet and other credentials, a pen, some cash, and a small camera disguised as a glasses case. Nothing too exciting. Lasers that can cut through safes only exist in the movies, unfortunately. The plan was working flawlessly. No one, besides security, paid him any particular attention as he entered the building. But then again, security pays attention to everyone, so that says nothing. He was a walking ghost. He followed his new co-workers. They mostly talked amongst each other. One of the workers approached him. He instantly recognized him as Sergei, a friend of the mark. He asked about my grandfather's facial injuries. He relayed the fabrication that I've already told you, adding to it that he is hungover and wants to be left alone for the day. Sergei politely agreed, and that was the end of it. No one else in the janitorial staff spoke to him. More importantly, none of them had the slightest clue that my grandfather was an imposter. He was in. He took up a broom and dustpan and made a mental map of the place. To this day he still remembers it vividly. Apparently spies are taught really effective memory tricks. He kept his ears open for any keywords in the idle chit-chat of the halls. Bomb, defense, computer, nuclear, long-range, missile. Anything that might catch his ear. For a solid half hour, nothing of note presented itself. The base had 3 floors and a basement. Each floor had offices and rooms with couches and chairs. To me, they sound like a therapist's office. My grandfather soon spotted someone who truly didn't belong. He didn't look like a scientist and he wasn't dressed like a janitor or a member of security. His eyes were glazed over and bloodshot. He walked very weakly. He needed help when being guided through the hallway. My grandfather came to the inescapable conclusion that he was a test subject of some kind. At first, my grandfather thought he might be a victim of some kind of biological weapon. But that couldn't be, he'd likely be quarantined if that were the case. As the man passed my grandfather, he lazily looked at him and said there's no anger there, while pointing at my grandfather's bruised face. He was quickly pulled away. After an hour of familiarizing himself with his surroundings, he felt confident enough to make a move. He slipped inside an unoccupied office after covertly picking the lock. Through a one-way mirror, the office overlooked a room about the size of a gymnasium. From the look of things, there were several other offices which overlooked the same room. He quietly searched the filing cabinets present. My grandfather quickly rifled through the classified documents and learned to his horror the truth of the experiments being conducted here. Tests in astral projection and other psychic phenomena were being carried out. There were written testimonies as well as photographic evidence of people doing the impossible. Replicating drawings that were made in other rooms, describing the homes of KGB officers and even secret United States military bases. There were secret code names and phrases sprinkled throughout the documents, some of which my grandfather himself could confirm the legitimacy of. There was one of a man laying on a couch with his eyes closed. He was holding drawing with a pen on a clipboard held up by a scientist. The drawing was of what appeared to be a U.S. spy plane. It was a crude drawing, but eerily similar to the U-2. The Soviets had weaponized people who were able to look over the shoulders of our top intelligence officials. The severity and extent of this breach of information was not lost on my grandfather. The rumors of this base were true. My grandfather took several photos of these documents with his disguised camera. There were more files describing how to obtain these powers and which methods were most and least effective. To this day, my grandfather wishes he never learned about this dark and vile science. He laments not being passed up for this mission. The papers described otherworldly fairies which sell these psychic powers to living people. My grandfather says that they are demons. A lot of different cultures have different names for them. There were also several diagrams of occult symbols that my grandfather dares not replicate. Photographs of people tied to the floor with the symbols drawn beneath them. They were screaming in agony. My grandfather couldn't believe his eyes. In the room below, some scientists were getting a new test ready. As my grandfather took the last of his photos, the door behind him opened. A scientist walked in and angrily asked what the hell my grandfather was doing. He dumbly explained that he was cleaning and the folders were on the floor when he entered. Furiously, the scientist explains that my grandfather wasn't supposed to be in here or going through files. He reaches for the phone. My grandfather lunged at the man. There was an intense struggle. The scientist tried to press his thumbs in my grandfather's eyes. From his position on the ground, he couldn't get the kind of leverage needed to do any significant damage. After a few minutes, the man was dead. He hid the body under a desk and got his gun ready in his pocket. It was now time to leave, Just before he walked out the door, the experiment started. There was a man standing in a fairy circle, with a few people holding clipboards and cameras circling him. His hands shot to his head and he wailed in agony. He clawed at his scalp, mad with desperation. The scientists coaxing him for details on an American military base. The man cried out about how his soul had been set ablaze. My grandfather could watch no more and left the building while fingering his pistol in his pocket. A guard approached him outside. My grandfather told him that he was feeling sick and needed to go home. The guard says he needs to ask a couple questions before he is allowed to leave. My grandfather does his best to cooperate, but is prepared to shoot the guard through his pocket. The guard asks my grandfather about another worker. Apparently he's under suspicion. My grandfather tells him what he wants to hear, and the two part ways. He made his way back to the Marks' home. He made a call to another spy in the area, explaining the situation. His cover is likely going to be blown and he needed to leave immediately. He changed clothes and grabbed a few of his essentials. A vehicle containing KGB agents quietly parked outside. My grandfather hastily escaped through the back, walking down side streets. He made his way to a safe house nearby. Another American operative lived there. He was on the phone, planning an extraction and speaking in code words when my grandfather arrived. Another group of operatives were going to make a distraction a mile or so away. The KGB would follow a false trail and give my grandfather the opportunity to escape totally undetected. All they had to do was wait for the area to die down a bit. Then, something strange happened. He felt a kind of intense emptiness. Normally he carries a pen. He supposes that he lost his pen at the base. Possibly during his struggle with the scientist. He suddenly became acutely aware of the lacking. The space on his body that he was used to feeling the weight and length of the pen was screaming out in overwhelming emptiness. Then, the intense feeling of being watched. Inside and out. He felt as a person might feel after being made. Found out, seen through, discovered. He insisted to the operative that they must leave immediately. He was brushed off. They waited in silence for 10 minutes. The sound of a helicopter flew overhead, footsteps just beyond the window covered in curtains. It seemed that the KGB were surrounding the house. My grandfather quietly opens the door to the basement and steps inside. An officer breaks down the front door. The operative shoots him. More gunshots can be heard and the operative collapses to the ground with a wet thud. My grandfather quietly closes the door and silently descends into the basement. A swarm of KGB agents' footsteps echo through the house overhead. In the basement of this house is a cellar door that leads to the side of the house. That part of it is packed tightly against a wall as well as thick bushes. From the outside, the exit is invisible, and luckily for my grandfather, was not blockaded. He shut and locked the cellar door behind him. As he did, he heard the basement door open. He did not have much time to escape. He fled to a nearby store where a car was waiting for him. My grandfather hid in the trunk for 15 grueling hours and traveled from city to city. The KGB was relentless in their pursuit. The driver was only just barely able to avoid checkpoints and roadblocks. Together, they escaped the Soviet Union, evidence intact. After coming back to the States, my grandfather was unofficially commended for his bravery and service. According to him, the Stargate project is based on the research he stole and it likely is still secretly running to this day. He says that psychics are real and that even now, he always feels like he is being watched not by a person, or an animal, but by an otherworldly presence, passively watching him, unyielding and unblinking.